Welcome to AINdebrief, where we take a look back at the most important aviation stories of the past week by the AIN editors who covered them. I'm AIN Alerts editor Chad Trautvetter. In this week's episode, I talk with my colleagues Jerry Siebenmark and Kerry Lynch about NBAA's virtual business aviation show last week. Jerry also explains Airbus's ZeroE hydrogen-powered aircraft plans. Kerry outlines Aerion's announcements this week about the growing backlog for its AS2 supersonic business jet and groundbreaking on its headquarters complex in Melbourne, Florida. She also provides an update on FAA DOT funding extensions pending in Congress and what the FAA is doing to prepare for a COVID vaccine regarding pilot medicals. And finally, Editor-in-Chief Matt Thurber gives highlights from Dassault's virtual rollout of the Falcon 6X on Wednesday. So before we start into this week's news, let's talk about last week. NBA had the V-Base show, so I just want to get everybody's thoughts on V-Base. So Jerry, let's start with you. What did you think about V-Base, and how does it compare to a real in-person show?
Companies certainly put out more news than I anticipated, way more news, but it really lacked, I mean, I know they tried, but it really lacked that face-to-face personal contact that you get.
Yeah, it's hard with a virtual show. I mean, I think they did a pretty good job of it, but there were some odd things that went on. Also, I didn't have a lot of conversations with other people, at least the way it was intended. Did you actually talk to anybody too?
Just a couple of people, and they were people that whom I know from here in Wichita.
So you could have almost seen him at the grocery store.
Right.
So, Kerry, what about you? Any takeaways from V-Base? What did you think about it?
Well, I'm putting it in context with some of the other virtual shows that we've tapped into or that have been attempted. And it clearly was an overall richer experience, well thought out, from, trying to put up virtual booths to having chats, although like Jerry, I didn't have the opportunity to jump in on them as much. And, they did have all the information centers or sessions. They had, one of the speakers was Erin Meyer, who was an author who wrote about Netflix. And she had a very interesting session. And, there were really good educational opportunities. So that's all good. The good news with V-Base is you did miss the face-to-face. And why that's good news is it for an industry that is dependent on face-to-face as the whole reason for being, I think V-Base just underscored the importance of the need for business aviation.
And did you hear anything from any of the exhibitors? Did they say anything good or bad about it?
I have not, Chad, I'm sorry, I have not checked in with the exhibitors themselves. I do know, I agree with Jerry that there was a lot of news to come out of it. There were press conferences. Each press conference was handled a little bit differently, but, there was some good interaction in a few of them. And so, like I said, I give NBAA a lot of credit for putting as much thought into it. And I know they're certainly looking for good feedback because they have a couple more virtual events and hopefully only a couple more virtual events.
Yeah, the big question right now is if eBase will be in person or if it would have to be a virtual event. So, and I think to that effect, we have to see what the vaccine does, how fast it gets adopted, and how many people get vaccinated in the time between now and about, I would say mid-February is when they have to make a decision. Although the cancellation of the Paris Air Show gives them a little bit of breathing room if they need to move it to June or July, because there's no conflict with that show now.
Can I just add that I think given the circumstances, I think the V-Base show was as good as anything I've seen thus far during the pandemic. What would be nice is if there was a sort of as Kerry alluded to, if there was sort of a standardized way of companies holding their press conferences instead of using multiple different platforms.
Some of them were a little confusing to get to. I agree. So, all right, well, let's jump over to this week's news. Actually, Jerry, you did a the Wichita Aero Club had a meeting this week, and they talked to somebody from Airbus about their ZeroE hydrogen project. So what is that, and what are they doing?
So yeah, speaking of virtual events, this was a virtual Wichita Aero Club luncheon or brunch, as Dave Franson put it, and it featured a presentation by Amanda Simpson, who is the Vice President of Research and Technology for Airbus Americas. She was speaking on the ZeroE project, which officially kicked off in September of this year, but actually, and it looks at hydrogen powered flight versus electric, or just strictly SAF powered flight. And she talked for about 45 minutes about sort of the platforms that Airbus could use or might use in this zero emissions project for hydrogen power. One was a conventional narrow body turbofan with a 2,000 nautical mile range and seating for up to 200 passengers. The other potential platform is a 100-seat twin turboprop with a 1,000 nautical mile range, and then the airplane of the future, this blended wing turbofan that would have a similar range and capacity as that conventional design. She said that Airbus plans to have a fixed wing design in place and to begin a certification by 2025. Obviously, with getting regulatory buy-in, she thinks it's going to take a while. So entry into service of that design will likely take place sometime between 2030 and 2035.
What's the challenges with hydrogen? It's not an easy fuel to handle, right?
Right. There are a lot of challenges. In Airbus's estimation, the challenges really come down to the aircraft design. You're looking at probably on each potential aircraft platform for the hydrogen, you're looking at sort of taking a third of the cabin out, of the passenger cabin out, just for, or reserving a third of the passenger cabin just for storage of the hydrogen. You're also, again, you have to consider sort of the regulatory safety factor of using hydrogen, and that's obviously regulators will need to be involved from day one on this project, and there need to be a lot of safety mechanisms in place along the way, and then there's the infrastructure, right? I mean, we're talking about SAF today, and one of the challenges that SAF faces is the same challenge that hydrogen is going to face, and that is, where's the infrastructure? Where's the ability to sort of fill up with hydrogen? That's pretty limiting at this point.
Right, and actually, she also kind of hinted that this technology could be also used in their helicopters as well.
That's correct. She said that their focus at the moment is on airliners, but that given they have a robust helicopter business, which accounts for more than half of the civilian helicopter market, that they're already looking at the potential for a hydrogen-powered helicopter.
That would be pretty interesting. All right, thanks, Jerry. So, Kerry, you actually did a couple of stories this week, but let's start with Aerion. They had some big news this week. They announced their backlog had increased, and also they're starting their new headquarters construction in Florida, right?
Yes, Aerion has been a news-making machine really since last summer after being quiet for a very long time. But the big news of this week, it started with the announcement that they had made a deal with Avion Pacific that actually enters the AS2 into China, and so it was a multiple aircraft deal. They did not say how many aircraft were sold under it, but they did say Avion Pacific would be a sales and distribution partner and help them grow their market in China. But what they did say also was that with this deal, their backlog now has a value of over 6.5 billion. That's a pretty significant leap from the last time Aerion revealed any numbers. Just 6 months ago, they were saying it was around 3.5 billion. So that's almost doubling, or it is doubling. And now, let me caution, that's not all from Avion Pacific. That Avion Pacific obviously helped push it along. And I remarked that to the company about how it was a pretty big jump in backlog, and the response was, yes, we're well ahead of our targets. They were hoping to be at 5 billion by the end of this year. So with all the news that they've been putting out, it appears that they're getting a lot of attention for their Mach 1.4 AS2 supersonic business jet. So in tandem, they're getting ready to make this huge transition into a production company. And with that, they need facilities. So this week, they also announced that they had broken ground on their $300 million value, 200 million square foot headquarters complex. And this thing is going to be enormous. The production facility, I think, is going to be the size of, 14 football fields. And, they're going to produce the aircraft there. They're going to flight test it. They're going to have an experience center for customers and for completions. They're going to have a lab where they're going to have an Iron Bird. They have some pretty significant plans.
Yeah, this is a pretty big park. I think they're calling it Aerion Park. And I think overall they have 110 acres they can build on there. And I believe previously they talked about also having suppliers kind of in that area as well. But they didn't talk about that this week though, right?
Right. And, it would make sense that they want to bring home as much as possible. And let me back up. This center is on Florida's Orlando Melbourne International Airport. And the Melbourne regional officials are making a concentrated effort to really build up that area. I mean, Embraer is already there to build up their area as an aerospace center. So there's a lot of incentives to try and lure interest in that region. And, with Aerion, they have big plans there. And interestingly, this new building is going to be completely sustainable. And that's a very important message for Aerion. And it's a very necessary message for Aerion to be able to get a aircraft that has the public perception of being, non-environmentally friendly, for them to be a completely environmentally friendly company. And some of the things they're going to talk about is use of solar power for as much as possible, reuse of rainwater, using sustainable materials to build the facility. So it's interesting. They're looking at it from multiple aspects.
Yeah, it's a big project too. And they're planning on building this starting in 2023 and then flying in 25 and certifying in the 27 timeframe. That's a pretty aggressive schedule for a civilian supersonic business jet.
It's a very aggressive, especially for a startup manufacturer. You cover this business for enough years and you see so many with these ambitious plans. And once it gets to the production stage, that's where all the problems come in, because you can milk along a program and get it to certification. But building it, you really do need the right infrastructure and the right financial backing. So having this backlog, having these plans, having the financing in place are all critical components.
Right. So speaking of critical components, this week in Washington, D.C., there's been a couple of things going on. One of them is funding for the FAA and DOT. Congress is trying to do a continuing resolution to continue funding because they typically kick the can down the road. They haven't done a full fiscal year funding yet for many things, I guess. So what's going on with that? And what's the likelihood they'll get this done before? I think tomorrow is the day that funding runs out. Would cause a shutdown if they don't do that, right?
Right. So it's gotten awfully complicated, but when is it not ever complicated, Chad? The government is being funded right now on a stopgap measure that was passed right before the fiscal year started in October. And but that stopgap measure expires today. So if Congress does not act to either pass full year authorizations for fiscal 2021, which is the fiscal year we're in, or a temporary, continuing resolution is what they call it, then the government will shut down because the funding lapse. So the House on Wednesday passed a 1-week extension to give enough time to hash out all the residual differences. And on the funding, I don't think that is as big a deal, but they're kind of trying to tie it to coronavirus aid. But they wanted to give that extra week to hash it out. And then it went to the Senate. And in the Senate, that's where it is now. And it looks like the Senate has every intention of giving another week's stay or passing this 1-week stopgap measure. But there's always people who pop up to protest various aspects that might not have anything to do with the appropriation itself. Right now, they have a massive bill, the National Defense Authorization Act, that they've been debating, and that's supposed to come up for a vote today. And there's so much contention about that bill that people are threatening to hold up the stopgap measure. So, the idea is they're not really wanting to shut down the government, and they really do want to pass it, but whether they get it done today or not is a big question mark now, and it may even go into Monday. So we may have a temporary shutdown, if you will. It's hard to say. I don't see any opposition per se to giving it another week, but having covered this. Again, you see this pattern over and over again, even with short-term extensions. There's no guarantee a week from now they're going to be able to reach consensus. And they've been working on these bills for months. I think the House has actually passed the DOT appropriations within a package. And I think the Senate has packaged it with other bills as well. So, a lot of the details have been worked out, but what happens between now and then, is anybody's guess. And on the coronavirus aid funding, it could get linked because there are people on Capitol Hill talking about linking them, but it could stay separate because McConnell has, pretty much indicated that they're not reaching a deal right now. So it could be that they don't tie it together, and then it just is that the funding is passed separately. That's anybody's guess too.
You gotta love DC. Speaking of DC, the FAA is also looking at the coronavirus vaccine. There's been some concern over whether pilots taking this, if it would invalidate their medical. But the FAA is expected to speak on that soon, right?
Yes, there's been a lot of concern, Chad, amongst pilots about being grounded or losing their medical if they take the vaccine. And the FAA isn't, if you have an unapproved vaccine or an experimental drug, then you're putting a substance in your body that's not authorized, and that could be a grounding event. So the FAA can't really say anything right now because there's nothing approved on the market. But what they have said is that they plan to look at it as soon as possible. And that's pretty significant because, we've been told a couple times, including by one of our own contributors, that FAA typically takes about a year before it approves a vaccine. And the reason being is they want to see what the effects of the vaccine and that it's safe to use. But this is an extraordinary time. So the FAA issued a statement saying that they would look at it, and they were waiting for the outcome of the deliberations of the advisory committee and then the FDA itself. And so we got word, or the news came out yesterday, that the advisory committee did recommend emergency authorization, and I believe the FDA is expected to grant that emergency authorization potentially this weekend. And I would expect something out of FAA on guidance for it soon after. The administrator is set to talk this afternoon, so I will listen to see if he has anything to add to that. What they recommend, though, is a little less clear. People are expecting they'll treat it like they do other vaccines with common sense guidelines. If you take the vaccine, give yourself a certain waiting period, 24, 48, 72 hours, to make sure you don't have side effects, to make sure you are fit for duty. Because the bottom line is, it's a pilot's responsibility to make sure they're fit for duty no matter what before they get behind, get into the cockpit.
That's right. So be interesting to see how this all plays out, though.
Yes, and I think we'll see soon.
All right, thanks, Kerry. So actually, Matt, you're on the tail end here, but it's not last but not least, I guess. This week, Dassault virtually rolled out the Falcon 6X. So what was that like?
It actually was a pretty good event. I was impressed at the quality. I mean, they did it on YouTube, and it was live on YouTube, but obviously some of it had to be pre-recorded. But it had pretty much the taste and feel of a rollout event, just that nobody could attend because of the coronavirus.
So it's amazing that Dassault was able to, this is on schedule, and it's pretty amazing that Dassault has been able to keep development of the 6X, which is a super mid-sized wide cabin business jet, on track. And it's been hard for them, but they've done it, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, the program's right on track, and Dassault jumped on taking care of their people right from the beginning of the coronavirus pandemic, and realized they'd have to take some precautions, and did everything they could to keep moving. A lot of people are working at home, engineers especially, and in the factories where they build the airplanes and they build their own flight control systems. In fact, they went full steam ahead with precautions, and it's paying off right now because everything's on track for first flight early next year and entry into service in 2022.
So I know that engine development is continuing. So Pratt & Whitney has it's the PW800 series. I don't remember the exact model number, but how's that going too? I know they've been working on that during COVID times as well.
Yeah, in fact, Pratt & Whitney has delivered the engines for the first flight airplane already to Dassault, and they've completed about more than 2,500 hours of ground testing on this is the PW812D engine. D stands for Dassault. And they've also flown the engine more than 300 hours on Pratt's 747 flying test bed. So that's there shouldn't be any delays in that program either. Plus, it's a well-proven engine family, so there shouldn't be any technical problems.
And the airplane that rolled out was hull number 3, and that's the one that's going to fly early next year, right?
Exactly, hull number 3, and more airplanes are in assembly right now. Once you turn that switch on, it's a big process, and it's moving ahead.
Yeah, I think the next two airplanes are not far behind. I know from photos I've seen earlier this year, they had three hulls under progress, and yeah, like you said, once you turn the switch on, it's pretty easy for them to start rolling down the line at a certain point.
Exactly, and just to give an idea of the process, I mean, it was last year that I visited Dassault and went to the factory where the first assemblies start to get put together, and it's an amazing process, but it also gives you an idea of the time involved between the first rivets being driven and the final assembly.
Yeah, I can imagine. And what sets this airplane apart is it will be the widest in its class, which is the super midsize. And they're taking advantage of that space by with the interior, right? They're doing certain things to maximize space, right?
Absolutely, yeah. It's the widest and tallest cross section of any purpose-built business jet. It's 78 inches high and 102 inches wide, and there's just a ton of room inside the cabin.
Yeah, and it's got a skylight too.
Yeah, that's right. The skylight came from the sort of the predecessor to the 6X, which is the canceled 5X, but there's a skylight that lets natural light in to the forward side of the galley just behind the cabin entry door, and that's usually kind of a dark place of the airplane, so that's going to be a nice feature.
Yeah, and they've kind of they've done a whole brand new interior for this, and it's a very clean look.
Absolutely, and with a really wide cabin too, you get a lot more aisle space as well. That's one of the big benefits.
So the timeline is first flight next year, and then have they said entry into service in 2022? Is that, do they have more of a do you feel that that's more first half or second half of that year?
It's hard to tell. I bet it's going to be right around the middle of the year, but typically for experienced manufacturers in this industry, at least a year after first flight is about the right time for certification, and entry into service isn't too far after that.
Hope they stay on schedule. I think it's going to be a very well-received airplane. And then they have another airplane after that. They were supposed to launch it this year, but they want to do it with the suppliers in person. So they kind of punted that down the road a bit. But that's what they're calling the next Falcon. It'll be a larger cabin, right?
Yeah, it's hard to know what the next one's going to be, but they're definitely working on it. They've given us plenty of hints that something's coming, but we're going to have to wait to see when they finally invite us out there for the official launch ceremony.
Yeah, it'll be nice if it's in person. So,
absolutely, we're all looking forward to that.
Yep, certainly are. All right, thanks, Matt.
Okay.
Thanks for listening to AINdebrief. Another podcast episode will air next Friday. In the meantime, go to www.ainonline.com for the latest aviation news from AIN.